Hi everyone, I hope that you enjoyed the replay of that panel on gearing towards businesses in 2021. We are now entering the second thematic track of the day, the manufacturing track, which is powered by McKinsey and Company. Industry 4.0 technologies were already transforming manufacturers' operation before the pandemic. But now, adoption is diverging between the technology haves and have-nots. And to open the session, our keynote speaker will answer the key question: how will manufacturing and its supply chains look after COVID-19? Ladies and gentlemen, here is Mr. Kenneth Ko, Expert Associate Partner of the esteemed McKinsey and Company.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the next session in this conference. I'd like to say I hope everyone is staying safe. I hope everyone is staying well, right? And I look forward to spending the next 30 minutes talking about this very important topic for all of us, right? Industry 4.0 and the new normal. And just as a quick introduction of myself, as Myra mentioned earlier, my name is Kenneth. I'm an expert associate partner with McKinsey, right? I've been a consultant for quite a lot of my life, but over the last 5 years, I've spent a lot of that time exclusively working with companies, both small and medium enterprises, as well as large global MNCs in the area of Industry 4.0 adoption and acceleration. And I'd love to share some of that, some of those learnings with you today, right? So we're gonna talk a little bit about why Industry 4.0 is highly relevant today. And I know you've heard a lot about this probably over the last few days, right? But I'm going to talk more about the manufacturing sector and what are some of those changes, right, that we're seeing these days. We're also going to spend some time talking about the challenges in implementation, right? And to hear more about what the way forward should look like for companies. And I'm going to start off by addressing the elephant in the room. Right? And we've all heard enough about this, right? But we understand that COVID-19, right? We have two pressures here. One, to suppress the virus as soon as possible, and one, to get back to normal as soon as possible, right? And as we've seen in the news, this is not an easy journey ahead. In McKinsey, one of the things that we do is we survey global executives on a monthly basis, right? To understand how is perception changing, right? How do these global executives think that this recovery is going to happen, right? And I'm not going to spend a lot of time, I'm not going to go into too much detail over here, but what the consensus seems to be, and I think we're all well aware of this, is that recovery is going to be patchy, right? And what that means for all of us is that the disruptions that we've seen in the last 7 to 8 months of 2020, they're not going to go away overnight. A lot of these new norms, a lot of these new realities will continue on into 2021, perhaps even further beyond, right? And that, I think, makes it all the more important, all the more imperative for us to take a longer term view, right? And not just worry about the short term effects and impacts and respond accordingly. So if we take a step back, right, some of these recent challenges that we've seen in the global economy, some of these including demand uncertainty. I'm sure many of us who are here watching this session today have experienced, right, drops in demand, sudden surges in demand over the last few months, just as trends come and go. We've seen how the economy, there's a lot of worry about the recession, right, and how certain sectors, especially of the economy, are much more vulnerable than others. We've seen also how this transition towards safe distancing, towards remote working, right? How that has been such a shock to our system and a shock to the traditions that we're so used to of showing up every day at the office at 8 a.m. or showing up to work, right? And how we've now had to learn in a very short period of time how to exist with Zoom and Microsoft Teams and all of these other tools at our disposal, right? But what all of these challenges have created, right, is a need for a great reset. And nowhere, I think, is this more clear than amongst industrials or in manufacturing, right? If we're not allowed to gather people in a certain location, how are we supposed to manufacture, right? If trade flows are disrupted around the world, how are we supposed to send our products and our goods around the world, right? And so I think this has been a time of great disruption, but we've also seen it's been a time of great innovation, right? And so we see that there are perhaps four durable shifts, right, in manufacturing and supply chains that are needed. And these are steps that are already being taken by some of the industry leaders around the world, right? And let me spend a minute talking about this, right? The first is around agility and customer centricity, right? How do we put our customers at the center of our operations, right? Where we're no longer optimizing our operations around lowest cost, lowest, fastest possible turnaround and all of that, right? But to learn how to be agile in the way that we plan and schedule our operations to meet the needs of our customers, right? Around supply chain resilience, with all these challenges that we're facing, around shipping lanes and airplane routes, how do we think about building out our resilience in the future, right? Some companies are thinking about nearshoring, getting more and more inventory placed closer to their manufacturing hubs to reduce the need of that future disruption. But from a digital perspective, right, how do we start thinking about end-to-end visibility of our supply chains so that not only can we respond quickly, but that we also get early warning, right, when things are about to happen? How do we make use of analytics in a way that allows us that allows us to bring a higher degree of predictability to our supply chains? The third theme, or the third reset then, is around speed and productivity, right? And as you think about how we now have to work with less resources, right, with safe distancing and remote working and all of that put together, how can we increase our own productivity to get more out of the very limited resources that we already have today? Whether this is through automation, whether this is through increasing the quality of our production, using advanced analytics, using data, right? How can we increase this productivity and this speed? And by the way, that is something that is extremely important if we are to continue to maintain our competitiveness in this day and age. And finally, a theme around eco-efficiency, right? As we start seeing more and more, especially amongst advanced economies, right? More and more regulations coming into play around regulations on carbon capture, on how green our supply chain is, right? I think this is also a theme that needs to stay close to the forefront of our minds as we think about the future. And so what I want to say here is that while a lot of companies have been forced to respond as best as they can, right? What we see is that in light of COVID-19 and all of those disruptions earlier, the industry leaders are leveraging Industry 4.0. Right? We've heard many stories about how companies who were further ahead, right, in terms of their digitization journey, in terms of Industry 4.0, they were much quicker in their ability to adapt, in their ability to respond, in their ability to deal with all of these disruptions that were caused by the pandemic, right? And so what we start to see here is a little bit of a two-speed response, right? Where industry leaders are making the most out of technology, making the most out of Industry 4.0 to not only stay ahead, but to get even further ahead, right? While the rest of companies who are responding or resorting to analog levers, who are responding in a reactive manner, right? They are doing what they can to stay afloat, to survive, right? But the risk of all of this, right, in one simple sentence, is that there is a risk that the gap between industry leaders and the rest of us is going to just expand, right? And so I think there is a clear and urgent case for adoption of Industry 4.0, right? If you are someone who is thinking about this today, right? If you are a company that is struggling to get started, right? I think the best mindset to take is that there is no better time than now. There is never going to be a better time than now. There is, who knows what 2021 will hold, right? Hopefully it's not another pandemic, right? But there will be challenges and there will always be fires to fight, right? But if we look at the bigger picture and if we reflect on how some of these industry leaders, some of the big household names that you and I both know, right, and how they have responded, and we reflect against how we ourselves have responded, I think we'll see that difference there. Right, and so let me spend a minute talking about how do we look at Industry 4.0, right? And we like to describe it as Industry 4.0 being characterized by 4 foundational technologies. The first is around connectivity and data, right? Getting visibility into our operations, getting visibility into what's happening on a day-to-day basis. One step up, we have analytics and intelligence. Now that we have that data, now that we've started collecting all of that data, how can we work with that, right? And make use of new and exciting technologies in machine learning and artificial intelligence to get even more insights out of that data, right? We then have human-machine interaction, or automation for short, right? Whether these are physical robots that are deployed on production lines, as well as also software robots, right? Robotic process automation. And finally, we have advanced engineering. And if you think about 3D printing, renewable energy, nanoparticles, some of these technologies we are just scraping the surface of today, right? And there will be a lot more development over the coming years. But if we think about all of these 4 different technologies then, right? These need to be applied end-to-end along our value chains, not just within the 4 walls of our factories of manufacturing, but these need to be extended outward as well to increase the visibility, the collaboration that we have with our suppliers, right? With our customers. As we think about product development as well, right? How can we utilize some of these advanced technologies in improving our speed to market, right? And so what I want to leave you with, right, is that Industry 4.0 should not and should definitely not be constrained within the 4 walls of manufacturing, but there is so much scope to think outside as well. And what we have seen in all the work that we've done in McKinsey, right, is that with the right execution, this Industry 4.0 can drive significant impact with companies. And it doesn't matter how mature they are, right? It doesn't matter whether we have started 5 years ago or we're starting today. It doesn't matter how big they are. We have seen success in Industry 4.0 for small and medium enterprises, just as well as amongst the large companies, right? And it doesn't matter what industry they're from, whether you are from manufacturing today, in services, in logistics, pretty much anything, right? This is a topic that is urgent and is applicable to you, right? And as I mentioned earlier, I think it's important that in order to keep being competitive in this new normal, in this new market, right? Companies do need to think about their own Industry 4.0 journeys and to seriously think about how to accelerate these. And so we did a survey recently amongst companies, amongst manufacturing companies globally, right? And we found that most companies believed that Industry 4.0 will increase in relevance, right? And those are some of the numbers that you see on this slide over here, right? 94% of companies found Industry 4.0 helpful in keeping operations running during the pandemic. Some of my clients that I serve in Singapore, for example, had issues with their circuit breaker and our MCO, right? With supervisors, with production managers being caught on the wrong side of the border at one particular time, right? And how am I going to manage my operations then, right? And only with the advent of technology, with remote working tools, right, were they able to continue, right? And so we also see that companies continue to be more optimistic, right, about the value of Industry 4.0 now versus last year. I think there is a very famous quote from, I think it was the CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, who said that we have seen 6 years worth of Industry 4.0 we have seen 6 years worth of acceleration in just 6 months, right? And this is a theme all around the world, that Industry 4.0, not only is it relevant now, but it is more relevant now in view of this pandemic. But at the same time, right, just to expound on a point I mentioned earlier, right, about how there appears to be 2 speeds between what the industry leaders are doing and what most other companies are doing, right? we see that this pandemic has actually widened the gap between the haves and the have-nots, right? Where the companies who were further ahead, right, could respond a lot quicker, had more resources at their disposal, and are, as a result, forging even further ahead. Whereas for various reasons and various constraints, right, a lot of other companies who started off perhaps a little bit on the back foot are still playing catch up, right? And as I mentioned earlier, this is something that as we go along, if this trend continues, what we are going to see is only a widening gap between the industry leaders and everyone else. And to make matters perhaps a little bit more complicated, our research shows that most companies still struggle to implement Industry 4.0, right? And if I quote another survey that we do on a global, on an annual basis globally amongst manufacturing companies, we do this every year, and for the last 3 to 4 years, we have found very similar results year after year. And if I focus your attention on the chart on this page for a second, right? The blue bars, 28% of companies are saying, right, that I have found success in Industry 4.0. I have gone beyond piloting and trialing. I am actually working on scaling this up now across my various locations, my various companies, my various businesses, my various factories. What about the rest of the companies, the remaining 72%, right? We find that for 72% of companies, a lot of them have started, right? It's not that they're doing nothing. They have started. They are working on pilots. They're working on trials, right? But they are caught in something that we call a pilot trap, which is that a lot of trial and error, right? We invest in something, we try something out, doesn't seem to work. We go back to the drawing board. We try it again. And this whole vicious cycle of pilot, fail, and maybe at some point succeed, right, takes a lot of time, takes a lot of energy, takes a lot of resources that I think a lot of companies are not able to afford, right? And so when we asked companies, what are the 3 biggest challenges that you face when you think about Industry 4.0? Because let's face it, right? You've spent the last 4 days hearing about how Industry 4.0 is important and how there's so much value at stake, right? I think everyone is aware that by this point, everyone is aware that there is value in this. So why don't we forge ahead, right? What are the challenges that hold us back? And if you take a look at those charts then on this page, right? A lack of funding because of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? There is a lack of good business cases out there, if I were to phrase this differently, right? And the second point, limited understanding of the technology and vendor landscape. If I were to paraphrase that, where do I start, right? Do I start with robotics? Do I start with automation? Do I start with AI, machine learning? With all of these technical jargon out there, where do I start, right? And finally, and very importantly, a lack of people skills and knowledge. Right? We hear very, very often from companies that there is resistance from the ground whenever we're trying to do something new, implementing new technology, bringing new solutions to the forefront. Right? There is resistance from people. People just don't like change, right? But also, people sometimes are not equipped with those knowledges, with the knowledge that is required to effectively act in the new roles and the new expectations that are that we want of them. And so, if I take a step back over here, right, there is a global Lighthouse network that is administered by the World Economic Forum, right? And what this essentially is if you're a company that believes that you've succeeded in your Industry 4.0 journey, you can make an application to the World Economic Forum. They will come and do some certification, some audits, right? And if they agree with you, you get on this list, right? And right now there are 54 of these sites or factories around the world that have achieved this prestigious accreditation, right? And quite a number of them are in our backyard, in our region, right? And you know, the first thing that you may probably think about when you look at this list is, oh, all of these are really large companies, right? BMW, Alibaba, they have plenty of resources, they have plenty of time, they have plenty of people. they have the capacity to move ahead, right? But I would challenge that assumption, because not all the 54 companies on this list are companies that are large, right? And there are SME scale companies on this list as well. Fast Radius, as an example, number 3 on the list, is a company that when they started their Industry 4.0 journey had 70 employees, right? They were an SME at that point. And so what I want you to take away from this is that it is possible, regardless of your size, regardless of what sector you're in, to successfully transform at scale. But perhaps the right question to ask is how, right? How were these companies so successful, right? What did they do well that 72% of other companies were not able to, right? What did they do right? What is the formula for success? And I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about this, right? And I just as a quick aside, I think if you have any questions about the presentation, all in the past as well as now, feel free to make use of the chat box, and we'll get around to these questions in just a moment, right? But I want to spend a few minutes talking about this formula for success, or this recipe for success, because this is important, right? You see, there are 3 elements that you see on this page: business, technology, and organization. And in a lot of the work that we do, and I've personally spent the last year probably talking to more than 300 companies in the region. And the most common pitfall that we see in Industry 4.0 is that companies think of this as purely a technology project, right? And what does that mean, right? That means they spend an undue amount of time thinking about what's the right solution, what's the best technology out there. Is this something that, is this a reputable solution, right? And what happens when we start off thinking only about the technology, right? Too many times we find that companies spend a lot of time, spend a lot of money even, investing in this. And 6 months down the line, they realize that we are not actually seeing the kind of benefits, the kind of results that we were hoping to. Some of the comments we've heard from, that I've personally heard from company CEOs has been that, everyone talks about how Industry 4.0 is supposed to get me 30, 40, 50% productivity improvement. I tried it, I'm getting 2%. And I've also personally seen a lot of companies who have invested in fancy hardware, fancy technology, right? Put hundreds of sensors around their production lines, only to find 6 months later that all of these sensors are still wrapped in plastic, right? Not being used. And when we ask them why, they say, well, my people don't really know how to make use of this. They gave it a shot, didn't really work out. I don't trust this solution. I don't trust this technology, right? And so clearly, I think there are a lot of challenges. But what then is the right sequence? Coming back around to what did those 54 Lighthouse companies, what did they get right? And I think it's important that we sequence this correctly, right? And first and foremost, Industry 4.0, just like any other transformation, needs to start from the business. And here, in a simple manner of speaking, right, it's about being able to focus our resources on the problems that really matter, right? And I'd like to expound on this a little bit, right? As business owners, as managers, as company leaders, on a day-to-day basis, I am fairly sure you have 20,000 fires to fight, right? And these 20,000 fires, COVID-19 or no COVID-19, you will still have 20,000 fires to fight, right? But if we take a step away from that, if we cut out the noise, right, you will probably find that a lot of these problems that we spend our time on, that we spend our resources on, they are important, right? But in the grand scheme of things, they don't move the needle, right? But for every company, there's going to be 3, 4, 5, maybe 6, right, key areas that if we were to specifically focus on them, narrow down, right, and prioritize our time and resources on these critical problems, that if we can get even a small improvement in any of these areas, it's going to drive a significant improvement in our financials, right? And the challenge here in the business side of this framework is about how do we cut out the noise and how we really get down to what moves the needle. For a manufacturing company, right, it's probably going to be along the lines of how do I increase my throughput? How do I increase my output with the same resources that I have? How do I reduce the amount of rejects and quality rejects that I'm throwing away? For a logistics company, perhaps it's how do I make the best use of my assets, whether it is my warehouse or my trucks, right? How do I reduce the amount of inventory that I have to hold? For a services company, perhaps it is about how do I get the most out of my people, right? And I would challenge you to think about what really moves the needle for your operations, for your business. And once you're able to get down to that focus, then we can start thinking about the technology, right? And here I think the mindset that is important in technology is that, again, it's not about big names or fancy technologies. What's more important is you need something that works specifically for you, right? That is uniquely customized to you and to your particular problems, right? And the analogy here is sort of like when you're buying a suit, right? You can walk into a fancy shop and buy something for a few $1,000s off the shelf. It probably won't look as good as a suit that costs half the price that is tailor-made for you, right? But wherever you start, right, it's important that you start thinking of it as a base that is scalable, right? So that as you continue your Industry 4.0 and your digitalization journey over the next few years, right, you continue to build on this base. And as a quick aside on this, if I think back about those 54 lighthouses, right, today, BMW, as an example, probably has plants which are fully automated, lights off factories, in fact. But that's not where they started, right? Where a lot of those companies actually started was in a lot more simple, in a lot more basic applications of technology, right? Thinking about connecting their processes, connecting their machines, right? In order to start collecting data and getting visibility into what's actually happening on a day-by-day basis and where I'm losing productivity, that was where they started, right? And if any of you are thinking about, well, where do I start my journey? A good first answer is always there, right? Think about connectivity, think about visibility. And then we move on to the third element, which is around organization, or people for short, right? And I think we've heard many of the other panelists earlier talking about this, right? And I will summarize this into two areas. One is about mindsets, and the second is about capabilities. Right? When we think about mindsets, right, I think this is something that is unique to every organization, right? What is the composition of my workforce today? Are they full of highly educated engineers, or are they full of production operators, blue-collar workers, right? Are they of an average age of 20 years old or an average age of 50 years old? And all of these different variations and actually influence the kind of organizational mindset that is there, right? And so it is important, yes, it is important for a CEO, for you as business leaders to set the tone from the top, but it's also important how you communicate it to your respective organizations, right? Because the way you would speak to an engineer and the way that you would communicate to an operator is different, right? And let's recognize that from the beginning, right? And I think being thoughtful about how we manage this change is going to be important to address the mindsets within our organization. And at the end of the day, if we want to change someone's mindset, right, what we need to capture are their hearts, right? So that's how I would address mindset. And finally, when we think about capabilities and skills, right, a good example that I like to share is in a lot of first conversations that I have with companies, they talk about, "Ooh, can you tell me about advanced analytics? Can you tell me about machine learning?" And the first question that I respond to this company is, "Can you tell me do your people know how to use Microsoft Excel? Right? I say that as a bit of a joke, of course. Right? I don't mean it that way, but it's actually true, right? In a lot of ways, we need to learn how to crawl before we learn how to walk, before we learn how to run, right? And there is a sequence to these things. And as we think about how technology comes in, changes the way that we operate, right? Changes the way that we work, there will be differences in our jobs and the roles that we expect from our people. So thinking ahead, planning ahead in order to prepare for those changes and to provide our workforce with the appropriate skills for those roles is going to be important. And so as a final word, if I step back, right, we talked about all of these three as individual elements, but in reality, this is something that we need to consider all three of these elements in parallel if we want to make this a success, right? And that is what defines and this is what defines the success, the people who succeed versus the people who struggle with the pilot trap, right? So I'm happy to take a pause right here, right, and to take any questions that you may have.
Hi, so thank you so much, Kenneth. Just before we address some questions from the audience, I would like to thank you for, I think, giving a very good framework of IR 4.0. I think throughout the conference, we've had a lot of specific knowledge, but I think the roadmap that you laid out was both fair as well as apt. One thing that you said that was that captured my attention was this idea of the pilot trap.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, after looking at the, this way, yeah. So after looking at these three steps, I kind of understand a little bit more about why people might end up in the pilot trap because they don't know how exactly to implement those three things. But I think perhaps maybe in the interest of COVID-19, a lot of people have lost their jobs, right? Understandably because of resource allocation. Companies need to tighten their belts. But when it comes to adopting this this technology during this time, because you don't want the SMEs to end up far behind and cause inequality in the market. But how does if you want to already invest in IR 4.0 technology, right? Is there a way to balance that with human cost, meaning to balance out the human cost? Just a little bit about that. I'm just wondering if you have any data, any studies regarding that issue.
Sure. Thank you, Myra. Thanks for that question. I think I'd like to make one overall response, right? And I'd like to correct a myth out there that I think is in the market, right? That a lot of people think that technology is going to come, robots are going to come and steal all of our jobs, right? And I think the reality is a little bit different, right? From all the work that I personally have done in Industry 4.0, I found that these new technologies do not replace people, but rather they change the jobs. And it is only when the people that we have are not skilled enough, right, or not prepared enough for these changes in their roles that this turnover happens, right? And a very poignant example that I like to flash out there is that I do a lot of work with SMEs in the region, right? In Industry 4.0, and one of the very first questions that I ask them is, what are you looking for out of this, right? Why are you interested in Industry 4.0, right? And not a single time have I ever gotten a response from any company that says, I want to reduce my workforce. It is not that, right? But many of them are more concerned about, how do I stay competitive in the market? Because if the more competitive I am in the market, the more resilient I am, that I'm not subject to sudden demand drops when something like COVID-19 comes around, right? And the more resilient I am, the more flexible I am, that allows me to pivot my business according to the times, right? And that helps me to not just, I guess, grow, but also to retain my people. These are thoughts that come from CEOs of SMEs, right? And therefore, I think, coming back to your question, Myra, around how do we balance that human cost, I think it is, if I could tweak that a little bit, right? It's not just about balancing the human cost, but it's about thinking beyond just dollars and cents. When we think about Industry 4.0, right? And as we start thinking about building a business case for any kind of technology that we want to put into place, right? It's not just about can I make more money? Can I make more, generate more sales and so on? I mean, all of that is great and all of that is good, but at the same time, it's also important as we think about the organization element, right? The people element. It's also about how do I redistribute some of this back? Because as people's roles start to change, and I recognize that I need to actually, as a business owner, invest in making sure that they're prepared for this change, right? And with these changes, the way that I manage performance in my operations is also going to be different, right? And so I would not look at it in isolation as just technology and humans, but rather that this is actually something that works a lot more hand in hand and in parallel than we actually usually think of it as.
Thank you so much for that. I think that brings up a really good point, and also I hope that will change, the perception and the way that people think about how you're going to integrate your businesses with technology, and hopefully it will make some of you out there remember that it shouldn't happen in isolation. So we have 4 questions for you. This is a lot amount of questions, that's good. So this is Sri from WebX. Thank you, Sri. With regards to the data shared, are there specific to Malaysian companies? Are these values found within Malaysia or ASEAN? I guess maybe another way to phrase his question, Sri, maybe, perhaps, you can correct me later in the comment section, is how applicable is the data to the Malaysian market or the Malaysian context?
Thank you, Sri, for that question. In response, I would say that the data that we have shared is not specific to Malaysia, but it is filtered out for ASEAN. But having said that, I do want to very quickly point out that even when we account for country by country differences, we still see the same themes arising regardless of whichever country that we're looking at. And so this is not just a Malaysian or a Singaporean or a Thai problem. This is a global trend that we are seeing.
All right, thank you, Kenneth. We have another question. And this is from Josephine from WebX as well. Do you think that all manufacturers in Malaysia can adopt this IR 4.0 easily? And is the unwillingness to change is due to the high costs?
Thank you, Josephine, for that question. I would say a little bit, I would describe this a little bit differently, right? I think the unwillingness to change is not so much due to the high costs, right? But rather due to a lot of perception out there, right? In the market around the difficulties, around the cost and benefit of adopting IR 4.0. I do think that the journey it's not straightforward, it's not easy, right? But it is important. And when it's done right, with the right kind of advice, with the right kind of support that companies get, we actually find that the business cases for Industry 4.0 can actually be extremely positive.
Yeah, I think that's interesting that you said perception, because when perception becomes wide enough, it can become a perspective or an approach, right, for some business owners. So kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Thank you for your answer. We have 2 more questions. This is from Al Malik from WebEx as well. Thank you to all of you on WebEx for being so active. What are the advantages of value backwards as compared to technology forward?
Yeah, thank you, Al Malik. That's a very interesting question. I think it depends on the perspective that we're taking, right? What are we trying to solve for at the end of the day? right? If we're solving to be the most forward-looking technology company in the world, then perhaps a technology-forward approach works. But I think for the vast majority of people, for the vast majority of companies, there is a need to prove a business case. There is a need to justify whatever investments that we're taking, whether they are in technology or not, right? And it's only with this understanding or with these business cases that we can move ahead, right? And if I can just call out perhaps the fact that, earlier on I was mentioning to Josephine, I think that that some of these business cases can be really positive. Personally, with a lot of the SMEs that I work with, I have not seen a single case where the cost of adoption or the business case of adoption has a payback period of more than 6 months, right? But if you think about this holistically as a business, right? You've got a proposal in front of you as a CEO that is, I'm going to get my payback in 6 months, and I've got something else that I'm going to get my payback in 7 years. Which one would you pick up? Of course, you would pick up the 6-month one, right? And that's why I think it's important that we start thinking of this value first, right? Because at the end of the day, that also determines how much attention, how much investment, how much of our resources do we want to spend on driving this forward. And as a business, of course, we want to make sure that we're always prioritizing the highest return.
Thank you, Kenneth. And we have one last question. This is, from Josephine again. Thank you, Josephine. How does IR 4.0 relate to the operations in the production line?
Yes, thank you, Josephine. There are many ways, right, that IR 4.0 can relate to the operations on a production line. And I'll just give you a couple of examples right off the top of my head, right? If we think about a standard production line with machines and some manual processes, right? I would think about it as what constrains this, what constrains the output of this production line today. It can be anything, right? It can be breakdowns, it can be quality rejects, it can be changeovers, right? A simple Industry 4.0 application could be just using very straightforward IoT, right? Simple sensors to start monitoring the machines that we have, right? And to start giving us the right kind of insights into, well, how much time am I losing to breakdowns? How much time am I losing to changeovers? How many of my products are going out there and getting rejected, right? Quality defects and so on and so forth. And with that very simple connectivity and visibility that allows you as a business owner and a business leader to take specific actions, right? On all of the areas that we're losing productivity on, right? That data that we start getting today, we can build upon that. And in future, right, with enough of this data, right, we can go into even more advanced use cases such as predictive maintenance, condition monitoring, right? Or even using new and advanced analytical methods, right, to start conducting large-scale experiments on how we can, over time, improve the throughput and the yield that comes out of our production lines, right? I'm sorry, but there are really many different use cases in production lines. I'm happy to spend more time on this too, if allowed.
Thank you, Kenneth. And don't worry, soon you'll see him again at the panel after this. I just want to thank you so much for everything and for the speech. That was very insightful. And for those of you over there, wait up, and I will soon be that side over there to facilitate the introduction of the panel. So thank you so much for your questions. I'm really sorry if you couldn't answer all of them, but for those who did, that was a very enriching experience. So thank you all, and see you soon.